All right. I just want to say hello and welcome, listeners of Vox Celeste. I know it's been a while since I have dropped an episode, and I know that my regularly scheduled program involves interviewing comedians and folks in the business of comedy. However, due to TikTok, I've been encouraged to sort of do this mini series that I will call the Vox Celeste True Crime Conversations with Madea. So, how did we get here? Why are we not yucking it up with comedians and talking about their lives and lives of despair and about mothers who kill their children? Well, a couple weeks ago, I did this TikTok about Jesse Ventura. Yeah, Jesse Ventura. I was thinking Ace Ventura, but Jesse Ventura, and how I was in Minnesota and how I was interviewing a mass murderer. And I kind of just dropped that in the video, and then somebody picked up on that and it was like, yeah, what are you talking about? So then I was like, okay, here we go. About 20 something years ago, I was working for a very small documentary production company in New York City. And I was a production assistant, a field producer. I was there for like 4 years. It was a great time. And 2001, Andrea Yates, the mother in Texas who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub, her trial, her whole story was just splashed everywhere, I think around the globe, because it was just a jarring thing to see this like lovely, seemingly lovely white Christian woman, dutiful wife, looks like a doting mother, do the unthinkable. And what was crazy about that story was they would always flash that picture of Andrea Yates' family, like in that sort of Sears portrait, you know, photograph. Like, nothing says all American than, a good family portrait session at Sears. But anyway, and it's like, everyone flashed that as to say, like, I can't believe this. And when they say a picture says 1,000 words, I think that picture was probably saying, help, I don't want to have any more kids. Help, I'm really depressed. Help, I'm losing my mind. I'm sure it was screaming a million things. To the regular person, they probably saw that and said, oh, what a lovely family. I wish our kids were so nice and clean cut as the Yates kids are. So anyway, that story like came and went, and then a couple months later, rather, after 9/11, two mothers killed their children in New York City, and I was like, "What is going on here? Like, this doesn't seem like it's an anomaly anymore." And I thought maybe the two deaths of the children were related to some sort of like residual post-traumatic stress after 9/11, because it was kind of stressful living in a city that just suffered one of the most awful terrorist attacks in, at that time, recent history. And especially when you were walking in New York City and you're seeing the faces of like posters of people like missing, looking for loved ones, and smelling all that stuff. I'm sure it had some effect on your psyche. So I was like, no, it doesn't make sense. And to me, even this was before I was a mother, it just seemed like counterintuitive that a mother would go through all the trouble of, bearing a child only to then take their child's life. So I started saying to myself, well, I'd like to just sort of, research this topic. And the more I got into it, I was like, whoa. And what I found was like, just when I started doing the research of the women, I think I researched probably like, 25, 30 women, maybe even more. But what I found, they were, irrespective of race, gender, socioeconomic status, the one thing that these women had in common, well, actually, two things. One is there was some severe trauma at some point in their lives, whether it was childhood, adolescence, adulthood, but some major trauma that sort of caused a shift um, in their psyche. And secondly, there was always some sort of inciting incident that occurred, like whether it's a couple of months, a couple of days, a couple of weeks before these women actually took the lives of their children. That sort of, I think, whatever underlying issues that they had sort of just put it on steroids. So that was sort of interesting to me. And so that was that was certainly the case with Andrea Yates, who had a history of, mental health um, issues, as well as not wanting to keep having children, but forced to. Also, the third commonality is the patriarchy. I know I don't, want to go off on some like kind of feminist academic rant, but like this notion of policing women's bodies, and keeping them in the confines of what um, they think their role should be, and it is barefoot and pregnant. So there's a lot of that. So when I was doing my research, I stumbled upon a woman who 3 years prior to Andrea Yates had killed not five but six of her children. She only had six, but she killed all of her children. And I kind of had to wonder, oh, why didn't this story get national attention? And the reason why it didn't get national attention is because I think in part of who this woman was. Now, before I get into telling her story, because she's going to be the first in this sort of mini series of Vox Celeste conversations with Madea, I just sort of want to backtrack and tell you like how the name Conversations with Medea came to be. It has nothing to do with Tyler Perry. It has everything to do with the Roman mythology. I'm sorry, the Greek mythology of Jason and the Argonauts, and his relationship with Medea, who, after was betrayed by Jason, kills their two children. So that was sort of where that came from. So that's what I did. And I embarked on this journey that took me to the Shenandoah Valley. I went to funerals of a mother who killed her child, and I will tell her story later. But I spoke with countless people when I was developing this project. I reached out to about 20 women who were imprisoned for killing their children. I wrote them a letter. And basically asking them, how did this happen? The news are very sensational, and it's very easy to vilify a bad mother. Um, and so I was like, yeah, I want to hear your perspective on this. So out of the, 30 women, I heard back from about, I don't know, five or six. And then the women that I didn't hear from directly, I heard from like family and friends. Um, of the mothers themselves, and I think it added a layer of compassion that I think that people often forget in these stories, that the mother who's done these acts is a daughter to someone, a sister, an aunt, a niece, so is a whole person, and the totality of their life and experiences led to that, unfortunately, fateful day. So one of the first women that I reached out to 21 years ago was a woman named Khoua Her. And she was a woman I said earlier who, 3 years prior to Andrea Yates, had killed her six children. And when I tell you that, when the trauma, inciting incidents, I mean, and patriarchy are all responsible for what happened on September 2nd, 1998, you'll see. Now, I wrote to, again, about 20 women. And so, and at the time I was working at the production company. So all the information, the letters, the phone calls came through the production company. I didn't want to divulge my personal information. And since it was, project I was developing through them, I really kept it within the confines of the production company. And so when I left the production company, I sort of had to abandon the project because I didn't really, have the means and resources to, um, you know, get a PO box or a separate line. So I had to sort of abandon the project, also because I couldn't get it funded. I mean, 21 years ago, nobody wanted to fund a project on, mothers who murdered their children. Everyone was like, oh my God, no, oh my goodness. And when I look at the networks that said no to me, and how their whole, programming is nothing but, true crime, I kind of laugh. but here we are. I'm not bitter. Not bitter. I've moved on. So anyway, I wrote to Khoua on April 15th, 2001. I mean, sorry, 2002. And about a week later, I get a phone call, a robocall from the Shakopee Women's Prison saying that there is a prisoner on the other end of the line. And I knew immediately who it was because she was the only person that I had written to that particular prison. And so when she answered the phone and I said, hello, and she was like, hello, I was like, oh my God, it's her. Uh, And so I was like, well, hello, this is Celeste. I see you got my letter. She was like, yes. And I was like, well, uh, I honestly was gobsmacked because while I was prepared to like sit down in a prison, setting with a camera and interview this person, there was something very different when you're just talking to someone on the phone. And so I was sort of like, I didn't really know what to say, which is really obviously not a problem for me. But I sort of powered through, the conversation and I said, call me anytime you want. And so I feel like at the time she called at least once a week for a few months. And then I like kind of pestered my boss and I was like, I really got to go meet this woman. Like, even if I can't shoot an interview, because the logistics with dealing with prisons was just a fucking nightmare. But I was like, even if I cannot like actually get an interview there, I need to meet her. So he finally said, okay. And, I went out to the Twin Cities and um, one of the first things I did was I took the car, the rental car, which I hate to drive, and I went to where Kua lived. I went to the projects, the Madea homes where she lived, and I sort of like looked around, and it was just to kind of get a sense of like where this ended, her story ended, because as you will soon discover, the beginning, middle, and end. It was like it was a tragedy from the start. So I did that, and then I went to visit her attorney at the time and spoke with him. And then I went back to the homes with a camera guy, and he was a local Minnesotan from a local television station. And it was almost impossible to get people to talk, in part because of the insular nature of the Hmong community, at least, from my end. And so um, people weren't really hip to speaking on camera. They were speaking off camera, but, not on camera. So anyway, I finally meet Kua. But here is the beginning of her story. But I want to just read this, her quote that she said before when she was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder of her children. She initially was going to trial, but eventually had a plea deal. And, you know, apparently she cried for 45 minutes, the entire sentencing hearing. I mean, inconsolable. But she said at her sentencing hearing, if I died, nobody would love my children. So just keep that in mind as you hear her story. Now, Khoua Her was born in the mountains of Laos in the mid 70s, right at the tail end of the Vietnam War. Now, she is Hmong, and the Hmong are sort of an ethnic minority who lived in Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and I believe Cambodia in the mountains. And now this is important because they were very instrumental in the very early stages and throughout the Vietnam War. The United States government recruited about 30,000 Hmong tribesmen to fight in the war in Vietnam. And in fact, they were the first ones to fight for the United States before any U.S. soldier came. I think that's based on what I read. And they were known as the Secret Army. It's part of the Laotian Civil War, but it was the largest CIA paramilitary operation ever. So fast forward, it's like now the end of the Vietnam War, And the Hmong who were helping the United States are, for lack of a better way of saying it, are ass out. And so the United States government arranges for about 3,000 of high-ranking Hmong army officers and their families to be transported to the Ban Vanai refugee camp in Thailand. Now, excuse me. Now, by all accounts, Ban Vanai is a deplorable shithole. It's got no running water. It's got no sewage. It's got really nothing. I mean, just absolutely nothing. No running water, and the families, irrespective of their size, are confined to these like 10 by 12 barracks. So, just to get a sense of like what the conditions were like um, for someone living in those places, in that place. But shortly thereafter, tens of thousands of other Hmong, fleeing from retribution and from the Laotian government, um, excuse me, are now on their way to Ban Vanai. They're crossing the Mekong River, and by all accounts, like tens of thousands died just getting there, or in an attempt to get there, rather, whether it's starvation, drowning, exposure. So this 4-year-old Khoua is now with her father and her stepmother. Now, her parents had divorced when she was 9 months old, so now she's living with her father. And by all accounts, her stepmother is quite abusive, and actually is the reason why, is a contributing factor, in my opinion, to how she ended up. But anyway, so so now she's with her father and her stepmother and the rest of her family fleeing Laos and making their way to Ban Vanai. Now, the average stay at Ban Vanai was about 2.5 years. Khoua and her family lived there for 8 years. Now, at the age of 8, she was raped. And when she was 12 years old, she gets in a fight with her stepmother. Her stepmother kicks her out of their home. And there, waiting for her, is a 17-year-old Tao Hung, and he invites her to his home. And I guess because of the tradition, uh, the patriarchal tradition of, now she's ruined. She's now has to restore the family honor by marrying this man. So now she's forced to marry this man at like 12, 13 years old. Now, one article I read said that Tao had always had his eye on Khoua, which is kind of amazing to me, because if you saw a picture of 16-year-old Khoua, she looked 12. So I don't even want to know what 12-year-old Khoua looked like for this 17-year-old guy, who, by the way, looked, like a 27-year-old man, would want with this woman. And when I tell you she's tiny, she's like, maybe 4'10", maybe at the time when I met her, 120 pounds. I mean, she was a little person. It's horrifying. So shortly thereafter, they get married, and she gives birth to their first child in like 1986 or so, at Ban Vanai. So she's been there for 8 years, and shortly thereafter, her family is finally approved, and they're headed to the Twin Cities, to the Madea homes. So now they're resettling in this new country, and by all accounts, Khoua is doing well, and she enrolls in high school, and then about 15 months later, she has her second child. So now she has two sons, and then within a year later, she has yet another child, um, Nolly, her first daughter, and then by the time she graduates high school, she has four children at the age of, uh, I believe, 18. So now, after the third child, Khoua had asked her husband, or told her husband, that she wanted to go on birth control because, she's trying to make a life for herself. And he said no. And so she just had three more kids. Now, her mother-in-law, every time I read any quotes from her mother-in-law, I just, whew, as they say, her mother-in-law would say things like, when Khoua came to America, she acted like a runaway teenager. And I was like, well, Miss Ma'am, she was a teenager. And her mother-in-law also said, she didn't even want to touch her first child for about a year after he was born. And I was like, Miss Ma'am, your son raped her. I don't know what I would want to do if I had to look at a child that was a product uh, of a non-consensual act. But hey, um, so after about 10 years of tumultuous marriage, they eventually divorce. Now, prior to the divorce, they had been seeking counsel from tribal elders, to no avail. And long and short of it was, a lot of the answers to Khoua was just listen to your husband. Stop dressing like an American. Stop being your full self. But in spite of all that, Khoua still, persevered. She uh, worked at a factory, um, and continued to sort of, kind of try to make a way for herself and her children. Now, shortly after the divorce, her husband, now ex-husband, files a police report claiming that Khoua pulled a shotgun out on him, um, and but failed to mention in that report that 3 days prior to the shotgun incident, he and a couple of his friends had come to Kua's home and kind of roughed her up, apparently, or threatened her and the kids, in an effort to extort her for money so he could go back to Laos and marry someone else. So that was one of the 17 times that the St. Paul ACOP, it was a community organization program, ACOP, that was an acronym, had been called to that home prior to the death of the children. So there were tons of red flags. Now, it's also important to note that the divorce was not only economically devastating for Khoua, it was also socially devastating for her because, at least at the time, divorce was a rarity in the Hmong community. And so, her being a divorced woman, I guess the best way to describe it was that she was like a Hester Prynne. Nobody wanted to mess with her. Nobody wanted to fuck with her. And so here she is with these 6 kids and really no village to fucking help her raise them. And so now, and any effort that she tries to put forward to sort of get her shit together, again, thwarted by her husband. So again, there's back and forth, and how at one point it, threatened to kill himself, and what, maybe it swallowed some pills, and again 911 was called, and at one point Khoua had to pick up with, 3 of her kids and go to Michigan and stay with her mom for a while, and she stayed there for, a few weeks, because at one point the couple had agreed to sort of split up the kids, that he would take the boys and she would take the girls. Um, so she comes back from Michigan, and uh, she, comes home from work one day and she's freaking out because she can't find 2 of her kids. Now, it's also, again, important to note that because she can't find childcare, because she has zero support system, a lot of the onus of the child caring is falling on the shoulders of her oldest son, Kue, who is about 10, 11 years old. So, a kid. And the youngest of the lot is about 5. So she, you know, 5, yeah. So she had about, 6 kids within like about 6 years, um, 7 years. But then, even still, so she calls 911. She's freaking out. She can't find the kids, and I can understand why she's freaking out, considering the history between her and her husband. Like, the threats of violence were just non-stop. So anyway, it turns out the kids were okay. They were just playing in some woods nearby, and she's again resuming her life. So at one point, she gets a job at this company, like a Hmong owned company, and she's doing well. She's kicking ass. And then her boss decides to rape her. And even though there weren't any charges filed against her boss, um, there was an order of protection that was granted, and so I'm guessing that that's enough evidence for me. So now, a few months before, like let's say 9 months before she took the lives of her kids, she and her three daughters are now living in a woman's shelter. And around that time, her oldest daughter, Nolly, says to her that one of her father's friends had raped her. And that story, now Nolly's about 8 years old at the time, and that story was independently corroborated by Nolly's brother. Um, and while somebody was arrested, Towel denied not only knowing the people, but that it even happened, that they were even in the home. So eventually, charges were dropped, and that was it. So, um, again, so now she's dealing with her own, like this, and again, this is off the heels of just her own rape, and now she's got to deal with her 8-year-old daughter's rape, and now it's like a month before her taking the lives of her children. Um, her car is impounded because she got pulled over for driving with, I guess, expired tags. So she has no transportation. And when I was in St. Paul, I didn't take any public transportation. I also didn't see much of it. So I can't imagine how she could, survive out there without a car with 6 kids, two, maybe six. So anyway, so she has no car. And then shortly thereafter that, she gets a notice from her housing complex that her rent, which I think at the time was $76, um, and I believe she was already in arrears, is going to double. It's going to go from $76 to like $140. And I'm sure some people are going, well, $76? What? $76 is a lot of money when you only have 32. You know what I mean? So the idea that, it's because her rent was so low that it's some sort of moral failing on her part is absolutely crazy. It was hard for her to keep a job for a myriad of reasons. One, she had no one to take care of her kids other than her fucking kids. And so, anyway, so then she gets this notice, and also that she's also going to be evicted because she's in arrears. And this is around about a month and a half before, again, she takes the lives of children. So now she's got no job, she's got no car, and now she is about to have no home, but she still has 6 kids. Now August comes around, and she's hoping that the assistance check that she was relying on to sort of kind of get her back into the economic fold does not come through for whatever reason, some bureaucratic um, bullshit, and so she doesn't get the money that she's expecting to get in August. So she has zero income, and she'd also been reaching out to people in the community, and there was one thing she said, um, like, nobody cares when you're poor. Like, when you're poor, nobody cares about you, nobody respects you, and that could not be. I don't think truer words have been spoken. Nobody gives a fuck if you're poor, especially if you're a poor immigrant, single mother, young. Um, anyway, so she's on the brink of losing everything. Now, it's been reported that, you know, up at, like, again, more antagonism from her ex. Um, and so September 2nd, 1998, that morning, a neighbor reported that she sees Khoua dancing sort of in the courtyard of these of the homes, like in this, what I was led to believe, a sort of ceremonial red dress. So I guess probably that's why it was significant, or also that she was sort of dancing. And then the woman noted that there were a couple of kids outside playing, and then the rest of the kids inside the home, kind of like looking on. And now, one story that I read said that she had decided to tell the children that they were going to play a game of hide and go seek. And so she called the children in one by one, and she told them to go hide. And so the children hid in different corners of the home. And it's been reported the way she did it was that she took a ribbon, and when she found the kids, she strangled each of them, one by one. She went from one kid to 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 one kid. And that is why none of the other kids were aware of what's going on. And then shortly thereafter, she took an electrical cord and attempted to hang herself. And then made a groggy 911 call saying, I killed the kids. I don't know why I killed the kids. Well, I mean, I guess if you listen to her story, I mean, I've kind of figured it out. And anyway, yeah. So that is why. And so when the officers, this Joseph Chaffee, was now when he responded to the 911 call, he knew the home because he had been to that home several times. He knew the children, and so it had to have been devastating for him to come to this home, to respond to this call, and to see these kids that he had seen countless times, even though it wasn't under the best circumstances, just dead. And he stated that the bodies of the children were still warm. And again, the attempts were made to revive children, but they were all gone. So the children ranged in age from 5 to 11. And so when I went out to meet Khoua, I was like, well, let's talk about this. I was like, okay, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to talk to her about this. I need to know. So I get to the prison, like our first meeting. And the thing about the prison is, first of all, if you drive past this prison, you would think that you were driving past like a high school. Like it just blends in with the rest of the scenery. It does not look like a prison. I think there is a fence, but I mean, other than that, it didn't. There's nothing about it. Even when you walk in, it's like you're walking into like almost like a college, I know, union hall or something like that. But anyway, except for like the metal detectors. But so she comes out. I'm sitting in the chair, and she comes out, and I'm looking at her, and I'm like, "Holy shit, you are so tiny!" Like so, like, and I'm not. Again, I am not a big person, so I am not in a position to talk about like tininess, petiteness, whatever. But I was just so kind of taken aback by how little this woman was. And so we're sitting there and we're saying hi, and I don't know if she knew I was black though. Because one, I mean, there wasn't the Googles back then. I think about that. Now that I'm thinking about that now. So I don't know if she was sort of surprised to see me. Because we only spoke on the phone and I never sent out any pictures of me. Anyway, we had a nice conversation, and she was asking me about more like where she would see this documentary going, and what she would think would come out of it. And the interesting thing about her story, no matter how tragic uh, it is, um there was a lot of conversations that were had about domestic violence, about maternal support, and the idea of these cultural culture classes, ugh, culture clashes, and which I think every immigrant population experiences. Like, it's in a lot of ways this idea that, like, yeah, tradition comes to America. A lot of people like I like to say, a lot of people like to bring their old worldviews and try to apply it to this new world. And unfortunately, the rules of engagement are not the same. And that was sort of the problem, that was the underlying current of the problem in Kua's marriage, other than the fact that he sort of raped her. But the underlying problem, I mean, aside, if that wasn't the basis of the relationship, it was partly because Kua had adjusted to America at a much quicker pace than her husband did. And she was able to make money. She was able to, go to school, and she learned English, you know. So, and he couldn't stand that. And that bucked tradition. And, in his mind, that wasn't the way it's supposed to be. And I think that is just the way I think most men think in their heart of hearts, and the core, of course, is that, I'm not going to have my woman make more money than I am. Where's the pride? And so, I mean, I don't know. That's crazy. But so that was, a huge part of the problem in the relationship, and just no one to support her. I mean, her biological mother lived in a completely different state. So again, this was sort of the case with, Andrea Yates, with her, and, a couple months before her taking the lives of her children, her father had died. And, there were more red flags in her case than a fucking World Cup match, because I mean, she had several hospitalizations related to her mental health. She had been on medication. She had been diagnosed with a shit ton of stuff. But again, that fucking patriarchy, that sort of Christian, women must submit and have children. I mean, her husband, Rusty Yates, said, when Andrea Yates said to him, listen, after their third child, like, listen, I cannot do this anymore. He said, we are going to have as many children as nature allows. And yet he is outside living his best life with a whole new fucking family, as if like a control alt fucking backspace restart. I don't know. And it's like, I don't know why these men are often like these unindicted co-conspirators in what happens to their children. It's always like, yeah, well, I didn't do it. That bitch was crazy anyway, so no, motherfucker, you helped her get there. I don't know. Anyway, that's that for now. But so anyway, so I'm gonna share throughout the rest of this series. I think I have like 10 women that I either spoke with directly, or their families that I had quote unquote conversations with Madea with, that I will share in this series. I'm telling you, yes, some of these women, a couple of these women that I met and came across were definitely not, I don't want to say evil, but when you go back and you look at their lives, you understand how they became the person they became. But this is the world that's going to happen. If women, the women that, in the Yates case and Kua's case, that are forced to have children, um, against their will, it doesn't end well for the mothers. It doesn't end well for the children. It does not bode well for society. And I feel like that's what these people are trying to do. They're trying to, this is about policing women's bodies. These rash of, Florida just passed I think a 6-week abortion ban. Like, I don't think I knew I was pregnant until I was probably around that time. Anyway, so I'm gonna tell more stories. I'm also gonna invite people who were integral in these people's lives, whether they're the attorneys of these women or family members, um, people they knew, they knew, who can speak on behalf of them and sort of give a fuller story. Because again, like I said, every villain origin story, it's always the mother somehow. And so that's why it's easy to sort of um, perpetuate this idea that these mothers are just inherently evil and not look at the sort of full spectrum of what got them to that point. Anyway, thanks for listening. Um, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.